organisations are being used, or is it smaller organisations?
Same perception, the same understanding, the same wishing and goodwill in order to prevent, to indicate, and to combat the terrorist financing. Because as the country like Indonesia, really huge, consists of thousands of islands, we really worry about the terrorist activities. So by having the collaboration, network with Australia and other region country, seems to me that it will be easy for us to overcome the problem when visible, especially about the terrorist financing. And next, about the how to make the same perception, we create the regional risk assessment. This is the point of us how to indicate, how to make the same problem, same issue that we can together hand by hand to protect Indonesia, to protect Australia and other countries from the threat, especially about terrorist financing and terrorist combat. I think that's all.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Counterterrorism Financing Summit represents a number of key issues. The first is a reflection by Australia and Indonesia that we cannot be complacent in the fight against terrorism. The summit brings together some of the smartest people in the world who are contemplating how we maintain our momentum in the fight against terrorism, not just in our region but globally. Whilst we are coming up with regional solutions, the reality is that we contribute to the global fight. Initiatives such as the Regional Risk Assessment, the first of its kind in the world, outline the areas of threat and risk that we must then focus our limited resources on and ensure that we are actually operationalising the legislation and policies that we have in place. The CTF Summit is renowned for its outcome focused. That is, that we must translate all of our discussions into operational outcomes. Specifically, we must disrupt and prevent terrorist acts from occurring in the first place. And you will see from the Regional Risk Assessment that it provides a framework for us within this region, Southeast Asia and Australia, to actually hone in our collaborative efforts with a view to preventing and disrupting terrorism in our region and globally.
Stopping the flow of money, it might not be as glamorous as other forms of fighting terrorism, but how important is this work of following the money?
Well, there is not one terrorist act that doesn't have in its planning some form of financing. It is the common factor outside of a perverse ideology that drives most terrorist acts. The other most common factor is, in some form or another, funds are expended in preparation. What we have learned in recent times, however, it is not about the quantum. We've seen that in Paris, the hiring of a large truck can be used as a lethal weapon. So therefore, financial intelligence units like the PPATK and AUSTRAC, we are now less focusing on the quantum of money involved, but on the profile of the expenditure of the money.
But by that you mean, is it a number of smaller purchases that add up to make something more suspicious? Take us through that.
Well, that's exactly right. Whether it's the hiring of a car, whether it's the purchasing of chemicals, whether it's the purchasing of camouflage accoutrements that people can wear, it is a number of acts when looked at together give us an indicator, a profile of someone who is behaving suspiciously.
I understand you're about to put out a report on the regional risk assessment. Could you give us an overview of where the risks lie?
The Regional Risk Assessment, first of its kind in the world, highlights probably 4 key findings that we will now in this region collaborate on. The first, of course, is self-funding. So those terrorists, those lone wolf terrorists who actually fund their own terrorist act. So that is one of the key findings that is consistent across the region. The second, of course, is the use of at-risk not-for-profit organisations. So these are often very legitimate organisations who are sending money to trouble spots around the world to help civilians who are suffering. Unfortunately, the intelligence tells us that some of these funds do not get to their intended destination and are in fact hijacked by terrorist groups and used for propaganda and or actually committing terrorist acts. The third, of course, is cross-border movement of cash and funds. The intelligence tells us that cross-border movement continues, and whether it's in cash or whether it's in the cross-border movement of value, that is an area that the risk assessment has also identified. Last but not least, the fourth area that was identified was the injection of funds into regions like ours by organisations such as ISIL, whether that be for propaganda, whether that be to allow people to buy air tickets to fly to Syria and be a participant in the war. That injection of funds is also a regional concern. So they are the four key areas that the regional risk assessment discovered. But I'd like to make an important point. The regional risk assessment not only highlights the risks and threats, but it provides a framework about how we can now use that knowledge to respond to those risks and threats. And as I said today in my presentation, we will not be judged on the quality of the risk assessment. Instead, in 12 months' time, we will be held to account on how we have responded to what the regional risk assessment has identified for us.
Yeah, for the cross-border movement, that's very important for Indonesia. We now making the bill. That in the bill we give the power to the custom official, so the custom will have the power to seize the body of the someone who come out Indonesia for a time, for example, because you know in Singapore we found that one piece is money. It is same as the 10,000 Singapore dollars. So it will change to rupiahs. You can imagine how much instrument can be buy by the terrorist activities to prepare the activities in addition to the terrorist activities.
Can you tell us how Indonesia...
Sorry, how common is it that mainstream charities, non-profit organisations are being used, or is it smaller organisations that are much harder to control?
Look, unfortunately, it doesn't discriminate, and nor does terrorism groups who will manipulate any charity organisation that they can. The reality is, and I want to reiterate, charity organisations, not-for-profit organisations have a critical role to play. There are civilians in war-torn areas that need support. So this is not about denouncing the importance of charities and not-for-profits. But the reality is, the unscrupulous nature of terrorist cells is that they will hijack, and as I said, they will intercept funds that were destined for people who are in need, hospitals that are in need. They will hijack those funds and they will use them for their own purposes. So our responsibility as law enforcement, as financial intelligence units, is to work with not-for-profit organisations, to work with charity organisations, and to help them ensure that their funds do arrive at their intended destinations.
Can you tell us how...
From the perspective of Indonesia, the NPO, Organization, we making the bill now in order how to give the power of PPATK towards where the money come from and where the money will be sent to anybody. This is the way how to prevent, how to know the source of the money, and the money will be transferred to anybody.
So the method's becoming more sophisticated for those wanting to fund terror anonymously?
Yes, they are, and unfortunately our success as a society in advancing digital financing technology also gets harnessed by terrorist groups. But that should not stop us from welcoming technology and enhancing technology. So many people around the world, in Africa for example, and other countries, have been the beneficiaries of financial technology. They're now able to bank for the first time in their lives from remote villages via mobile phone. So we are not about discouraging technology. However, we have a responsibility to work with financial institutions that are developing these digital financial technologies and applications and making sure that they are as safe as possible, that they protect the financial institution and that they protect the customers and the civilians that actually use them.
So big business banks have as much of a global responsibility as governments do?
That's absolutely correct. We welcome the fact that today and over the last 3 days and over the next 2 days, there are strong representatives from industry here with us, and they have been collaborating with us on these very issues. The future, the 21st century, the kind of threats and challenges that we face demand that law enforcement agencies, financial intelligence units around the world collaborate genuinely with the private sector in a trusted partner framework.
Recently, Australian government put Bitcoin under the counterterrorism bill. Are there any significant findings or fact that shown that Bitcoin as a potential threat to terrorism movement?
Well, the reality is, as we saw with Bitcoin in its early days, it was manipulated by organised crime. So there is nothing to suggest, and in fact the intelligence would suggest, that terrorist cells will manipulate Bitcoin and any other means for them to generate their funding. So the reality is we must again be vigilant and work with the Bitcoins and other financial institutions to ensure that we target harden the capabilities of Bitcoin and other virtual currencies so that they are not manipulated that simply.
Can you tell us how...
All this time, are the Bitcoin already cooperate with AUSTRAC and some other financial intelligence unit?
We find that the private sector has been extremely positive in any responses that we've sought, and we're currently collaborating with a broad range of the private sector, not just the financial sector, but much more broader than that as well. So we're very pleased, in fact, with the response by the private sector in the past and its ongoing response.
Ya, dari perspektif Indonesia, Bitcoin salah satu ancaman yang kita lagi pikirkan sekarang. Bagaimana mengatasinya, karena ini kan bicara orang the main behind the curtain. Tapi sampai sekarang bahwa BI belum memberikan izin tentang Bitcoin, namun kita dapat informasi sudah digunakan oleh oknum tertentu, ya by something in Bali, especially houses.
Can you tell us how the risk for terrorism financing in Indonesia compares with other countries in the region, specifically Malaysia and the Philippines?
Yeah, we found that some money transfer from Middle East and from the Middle East to Indonesian people and send the Philippines to buy the firearm, and also we very care about the cash movement from our neighbor, especially like Malaysia, Singapore, and so on.
How does the risk, is the risk higher in Indonesia or compared with the region?
Seems to me day to day higher, yeah. But we take the special step in order to prevent and to overcome this problem. Yeah.
And just on that point, I'd like to pay a compliment to the PPATK. I think the work that it's doing here in Indonesia and its collaboration with regional countries such as Australia is outstanding.
Do you have a temporary data of how big is this money value for financing terrorism activity?
We don't. I wish we did. If we had that figure, that would infer that we know everyone that's using financing for terrorism. The reality is that we don't, but that doesn't prevent us from identifying the methods by which terrorism can be funded and then endeavouring to stop funding at its source. And that's what the regional risk assessment is actually all about. Yes, some of the risks are higher in some countries than others, but what the regional risk assessment confirmed is a commonality of the risks that we all face. And again, that allows us now to work together. So we often talk about collaboration. This risk assessment allows us to collaborate on the highest threats that we face in this region. And that's a very important framework upon which we can move forward.
Those figures we saw in the report of Australian figures of some 536 suspicious transactions to fund terror, where were they going specifically, to which range groups? Are we talking ISIS, or are we talking a host of different...
What that represents, first of all, that figure of 536 is, again, outstanding contribution that the private sector is making to fighting terrorism, and of course the work of our own intelligence and law enforcement agencies. The reality is, as I mentioned, those funds go to existing terrorist organisations, or they go to the self-funding of lone wolf actors.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Yusuf in Bahasa before we finish the conference?
Silakan yang bahasa Indonesia yang mau tanya.